Chapter 4: Pushing Ingenuity. The early 20th century was full of mechanical innovation. And to keep their product front and center, Shell sponsored and supplied petrol to aircraft, automobiles, and other vehicles. The 1907 Peking to Paris motor rally was won by a vehicle using Shell Spirit motor oil, and 2 years later, Louis Blériot became the first pilot to cross the English Channel from Les Baroques to Dover, a distance of 22 miles, using Shell's fuel. Shell also supplied fuel for the first historic transatlantic flight. Shell had rebranded with the now iconic red and yellow colors, a reformed and simplified pectin-shaped logo, which was now appearing on cars, motorcycles, postcards, and lorry bills all over the world. These experiments with automobiles signaled a shift to the mass adoption of automobiles and the increasing available commercial aircraft, which drove a massive demand for oil, especially after the invention of the jet engine. Shell was perfectly positioned to capitalize on this, opening up the company for years of expansion. Giving them an advantage was the breakup of Standard Oil into 43 different companies after U.S. lawmakers deemed the company in violation of antitrust legislation. Standard Oil had become a monopoly. Two of the companies that emerged were Exxon and Mobil, later merging again. But some economists have estimated that the company would have been worth around $1 trillion by 2000 if it hadn't been broken up. Standard Oil's loss was Shell's gain. Between 1897 and 1927, the value of the company skyrocketed from $1.8 million to $26 million, which would be the equivalent of a $66 to $456 million jump today. With success came new problems, though, and would soon lead to the seizure of valuable equipment. They were about to be entangled in a global conflict that would both make and nearly break the company. Chapter 4: The Business of War. With the outbreak of World War I, Shell quickly became a key partner for the Allied forces. Their office in London was solely for the war. In particular, specialized aviation fuel was being produced in the United States with the help of newly founded Shell Chemicals, which innovated new refinements methods. The partnership with the British paved the way for more expansion directly after World War I, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. When Germany invaded Romania in 1916, it wiped out 17% of Shell's worldwide production. This didn't slow down the relentless march of the company, though, which continued to expand and by 1930 was the world's biggest oil company, producing 1/10 of global crude oil. This fuel source was vital for the Allies during the war, so much so that Shell's tankers were taken control of by the British government, classified as essential for the war effort. In 1927, between the two wars, Marcus Samuel, now given the title of Viscount, with commemorations led by the London business and political community, his contributions to both the private and public spheres were enormous, and what he had spawned had reached heights that even he never could have imagined. To break in the 1930s, Shell finished their global headquarters in London, named the Shell Mex House. By 1935, Shell was already employing 180,000 people around the world. After the war, when its tankers were returned to private hands and facing the huge task of restructuring the company from the ruins of World War II, Shell set out on even more ambitious projects. Exploration programs in Africa, South America, Borneo, and the Niger Delta were carried out with their newest addition to the fleet, the supertanker. Over the next few decades, Shell was on the cutting edge of new research and technology, like improved drilling techniques and 3D seismic technology. But some of this research was kept hidden from the public. Chapter 5: Heating Up. As an oil company, Shell has continuously been at the center of fears about environmental degradation, pollution, and climate change. And during the 1980s, nobody knew more about the impact of fossil fuels than oil titans like Shell and Exxon. Agreeing with an early report of internal research made by Exxon, Shell sponsored research in 1988 which concluded that CO2 levels would double as early as 2030, and that the sea level would rise approximately 1 meter, and even more terrifyingly, that the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet would lead up to a 6-meter rise in sea levels. Experts at the company warned that large-scale ecosystem and agricultural destruction would follow, and that sources of fresh water would be eliminated with changes in temperature and precipitation levels. Researchers wrote that policy options should be considered because the effects were potentially the greatest in human history. Despite having more evidence than any other organization, though, Shell publicly denied any correlation between carbon emissions and climate change. Instead, they sought to discredit any assertions made about the damaging nature of their business, and the details of that confidential report were not released until 2018. In the 21st century, Shell began marketing itself as a supporter of climate change science and action, advocating for the Paris Climate Agreement and a shift towards green energy. The company now describes itself as an active player in transforming the global energy system, transitioning to cleaner and lower carbon alternatives, and making pledges to reduce fossil fuel dependency. But talking is one thing, actions are another. Shell still spends tens of millions of dollars each year lobbying against climate policies to keep the company as profitable as possible. Chapter 6: Now and the Future. Shell's projected emissions between 2018 and 2030 are on track to account for 1.6% of the global carbon budget, and in the previous decade, only 1% of its long-term investments went towards energy like wind and solar. Going into the future, Shell plans to grow its fossil gas business by 20%, while a study found that almost $4 billion of Shell spending in 2019 conflicted with the International Energy Agency's guidelines. This has led to many critics accusing Shell of greenwashing their corporate image and history by deceptively presenting themselves as environmentally friendly, and it goes against what Shell has been telling their own shareholders. Chief executive of the company, Wael Sawan, told investors that the company would abandon plans to cut oil production and that it would be irresponsible to reduce output right now. In response, advocacy group Greenpeace installed a sign outside Shell's London office that read, quote, "Our profit, your loss." This year, Shell posted second quarter profits of $5 billion, and last year was more than twice that. The entire earnings for 2022 were almost $40 billion. A company once started by Marcus Samuel along with his brother over 100 years ago has grown into the fifth largest oil company on the planet. Last year alone, Shell produced 692 million barrels of oil, over 1,800 per day, and now makes up almost 12% of global market share. And the Shell logo, which began as a tribute to a Shell merchant father, is now synonymous with oil, and one of the most recognizable on the planet.